Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome everybody. My name is Chris Nanda, and I'm a member of the board of directors here at the Ottawa branch of the National Association of Federal Retirees. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the Ottawa branch is located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people for their valuable past, present, and future contributions to this land and country. On behalf of the Ottawa branch, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Summer Heat: What Most Canadians Don't Realize and How to Stay Safe, with Dr. Glen Kenny from the University of Ottawa. Dr. Kenny has held many webinars with the Ottawa branch over the years, presenting cutting-edge research to our members on heat and its effects on us. Many of our members have also participated in the research Dr. Kenny and his team conduct at the Human and Environmental Physiological Research Institute, or Research Unit, which helps make these webinars possible in the first place. I've also taken part in some of these studies, and it is good to know that we're playing a small part in helping with this important research. So thank you again for being with us again this morning, Dr. Kenny. Before we begin, I want to give a special welcome also to anybody here who is not yet a member of the association. We hope that these webinars will inspire you to join us. And to our members, we hope these webinars will encourage you to maintain your relationship, your membership. I also want to mention that closed captions for this webinar are available in both French and English. To access this feature, click on the closed captions button at the bottom of your screen. To translate to French, click on the little arrow next to the closed captions button and select the translate option. Finally, if you do have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and Dr. Kenny will be able to answer them after his presentation. That's all for me, so I'll pass it over to our presenter, Dr. Glen Kenny.
Thank you, Chris. Greatly appreciate the opportunity to present to everybody today. And bonjour à tout le monde. I will now go to share. Share that screen. And hopefully, and Antoine, you can let me know if everything looks good on your side. So I'm going to just get this going and we'll swap. All right. And here we go. So thank you very much, everyone. It's, again, a thrill to be with you. As Chris noted, he's participated in studies, and several of you have participated in many of our trials. And again, you may have heard already that Health Canada is using our guidance, World Health Organization is using our guidance, all based off of your contributions, not just from the public health perspective, but also from an occupational health perspective. But we're going to focus today on really what are the consequences of heat exposure and what we need to know about keeping safe. So in today's presentation, we have to realize that the information that we're presenting and some of the data I'm going to show you in the best practices when it comes to protecting people is based off the contributions of many of your members from the National Association of Federal Retirees. You've participated in various studies, so it's evidence-based, and this has been very pivotal and for us in terms of providing the guidance that we need to protect the most vulnerable. So to that end, I think what the biggest question we want to ask ourselves is, when we think about deadliest weather events, what are the most hazardous? And there's no question that certainly we see cold-related deaths associated with tornadoes and violent storms and flooding. But heat is the number one killer. It's a silent killer. And we've already experienced in Europe a brief but deadly heat wave in early spring. And certainly in the US, they've experienced high heat. And one of the most important things that we have to recognize is that even right now, even though we've not had that warm summer or that warm spring, we're more vulnerable because we've not had that opportunity to adapt. To that end, I think when we take a look at heat waves, and I sort of want to walk us back because many of us forget, we always think that the problem associated with extreme heat is just something new. But we got to go back, even go back 16 years ago in 2010, July 4th to July 9th, we had record-breaking humidex, highs of 40 in terms of humidex. We had 106 deaths in Quebec in our neighbors in Montreal area. Ontario did not have deaths. It was attributed to the fact that we had more access to air conditioning. And if we think back in 2018, not long ago, on Canada Day, if you remember on Canada Day, we had a humidex of 47 degrees Celsius. So we're not far away from July 1st. But even that heat wave started in June 29th. And even when we think back just last year, we had six distinct heat waves. They started in June 23rd. We had in Ottawa on June 23rd a temperature of 35 degrees Celsius. So if we go back in time, you probably remember some of these. And certainly again, in 2020, for example, on July 19th, we suffered some of the hottest conditions, 10 days above 30 degrees Celsius. So the reality is we'll be facing those. It's just the challenge right now, even though we see these heat events across Canada and they vary, the problem for us here in Ottawa is that we just don't have that exposure yet. And that puts us all at risk. So at the end of the day, I'm going to ask you who's most vulnerable. If you were to take a look at these four categories of individuals, who do you perceive as being most vulnerable? The short answer is we're all vulnerable. All of these individuals are vulnerable. Older adults, children, those with chronic health conditions, and certainly workers. Now, what are the challenges when we think about being exposed to heat? Ultimately, what we see is just that loss of capacity as we get older or we become less fit. And we see this also just, we can't always think about aging as being the most detrimental because I know a lot of you guys are out there training in exercising and you're preserving that capacity to lose heat. But functionally, what happens is we get older, we just simply lose that ability to dissipate heat. Even young persons who are sedentary, have very similar age-related decrements in their capacity to lose heat. So we gain more heat. Why? Because we have lower skin blood flow. So your lower skin blood flow means lower skin temperature. So when you're going to go outdoors, it's warmer than your skin temperature. 35 degrees is your average skin temperature outdoors in the heat. And if air temperature is hotter, you're going to gain heat. Certainly because of the solar radiation, you're going to gain heat. And if you can't offset that with greater sweat production, that means your body will heat up. But remember, sweating more is not a success story either, because again, the problem that we have to think about is when we're exposed to heat, we sweat a lot, and that creates dehydration. Unfortunately, our thirst sensation never keeps up. And I can show you later on my own experience at an extreme heat event that essentially you can lose a significant amount of that water in your body that essentially creates a strain on the heart, and the heart has to work so hard to be able to maintain that normal function. So with aging, what do we see with aging? Young adult, more sweating. But remember, more sweating is not an ideal thing all the time, because I'm sure if you're running down the canal going for a walk and you've seen some young person, they're sweating profusely, their t-shirts are wet, their skin is wet. Sweat dripping off the body is providing absolutely no cooling to the body. It can drip off, provide cooling on the asphalt, but that's no benefit to us, right? So again, less sweating. In some ways, it can be a benefit, but again, realizing that is probably it is the only avenue for heat dissipation if we get to those peak temperatures like we did July 1st of 2018 Canada Day. That would be insufficient. We must rely upon sweating to cool our body. The broader challenge at the end of the day, folks, is as well to recognize that the heart is so pivotal. Think about what happens when we are exposed to heat. You have hundreds of miles of that skin vasculature, and if you're active, you got to get rid of that heat. So you're pushing all of that heat to the skin. Well, how do you get it to the skin? You open up the skin vasculature. So what ends up happening is, because you've got all these pipes and tubes and vessels that are opened up, now to maintain pressure and flow, your heart has to work so much harder. And that creates a strain. And imagine it's like exercising. You can overstrain your heart And that can lead to, in some situations, if you have a cardiovascular disease or unbeknownst to you, cardiovascular disease, you may have that strain on the heart that can cause a heart attack. So there's that risk. Now, the other thing that I think is extremely important is that we see this all the time, is that many people don't feel heat the same way. And as we get older, we don't sense that change in our response. So we know our body's physiology is reacting, but we just don't perceive it. And that becomes a problem because then we don't recognize the risk that you are experiencing. So for the most part, when we ask individuals that are exposed to day-long heat, it's not until things get a little serious, when the body's under undue stress, that people start to feel a bit uncomfortable or they feel things as changing. And that will be important today because, again, one thing to recognize is you may be sitting in the heat. Unbeknownst to you, your body's fighting hard, your core temperature is high. So, in response to keeping that core temperature safe, your body's working so hard, it's sweating, it's dehydrating, heart's working hard. But ultimately, what can happen is you may not sense that because you don't recognize that that's necessarily happening. And as we get older, we just sweat less. So you're thinking, oh, I'm not overly hot. I'm not sweating that much. The problem is you're not sweating because your body lacks that capacity. So you may feel well. The problem is over time, what you're going to see is you're going to feel that strain. And it can lead to what we call heat-induced syncope. So suddenly you get up from your chair or suddenly you feel this dizzy spell. That can occur. So my next question for all of you is ultimately, what is a high risk temperature? When does heat become dangerous? And certainly, we may think that maybe it's only 40 degrees. But ultimately, any heat exposure, if it causes a stress on the body, remember, even 26, I want you to think 26. And some of you participated in our study because we did indoor temperatures at 26. But I want you to think about if I was to go into your home right now, crank up that thermostat, put it at 26 degrees Celsius, would you be comfortable? You may not be comfortable. Your body will be under stress, but the point will be that you can defend that. Why is that important? Well, some of you probably heard on The Citizen, there was a news article, and I was interviewed as well for that with Catherine McKinney, MPP for Ottawa, who proposed an indoor temperature threshold for tenants for the Tenancy Act, excuse me, where there would be requirement for landlords to activate air conditioning above 26. Why is this important? I'm not going to show you all of the rest of the stuff here, but if you're exposed to indoor at 22 degrees, 22 is still warm, right? Some of you may feel a bit warm. 22 degrees is obviously an air-conditioned space. 26 degrees would be a recommended indoor temperature based off our work. Why? Because it maintains that core temperature, slight elevation, but it maintains there. That's assuming you're resting. You're not active around the home. You're not overdressed. You're there resting. When you get into higher temperatures, it's not that you're essentially at higher risk, but what you have to remember is that core temperature is going to go up. Now, if the conditions are compensable, meaning that if it does not exceed your body's capacity to lose heat, my apologies, your body will be able to defend that. And so what happens in that situation is you're under stress. Excuse me. So what ends up happening, your core temperature is high, but your body's working hard. And when you see over here, you'll see this little image. Well, that leads to us having dysfunction in some of our organs, our kidneys, our gut, and the way it functions because the stress is high. Even though you think you can handle it, the problem is it's like you going out for a long walk. At some point, yeah, you can walk for many hours, but that fatigue, that stress causes problems in your body. So in certain situations as well, this may be, for example, when you look at a young person, as I said, they have capacity to lose heat. So they will regulate a lower temperature. Their core temperature still goes up in the heat. Unfortunately, yours goes higher. So yes, you may defend against that. Your core temperature is high. You may not recognize that. But in certain situations, there are those that are vulnerable, that will collapse, even at those temperatures which you are safe at. Now, I would also tell you that some of you may go out there one day and it may be a warm day at 31 degrees Celsius, and you say, no problem, Glenn, I can take it. Well, having been exposed myself, excuse me, don't know what's going on with all that heat. Maybe I'm just struggling here. But when you can be exposed to different days, it's like you going training. Imagine you're going to do some work, and you're some days you're very active, and the other day I just don't feel the same way. Well, your body can react to heat the same way, and one day, same exposure, and you may not be able to compensate, and you may collapse. So one of the most important things is that essentially, sorry about that. So one of the most important things that we have to think about as well is that there is an accumulation of strain throughout the day. So one of the most important things that we recognize is that when we are exposed to heat, there is going to be an accumulation. So when we think about heat waves, when we think about what happens when it's hot, nighttime, importantly as well, there may not be that reprieve where the cooling occurs, where temperatures are not lowered. In fact, in many of the heat waves that we've had in Ottawa, we've had days where temperatures remain high. And I imagine if you tried to sleep at 26 degrees Celsius, you're not going to have adequate recovery. Your body's going to be under strain. So what we see here over time, over the daytime, is that accumulated strain builds. The nighttime, if it's not cool enough, you don't have enough recovery. And over successive days, what you're going to see is a buildup in that strain. So even though it's mild level of strain, you're going to see gradually your body's physiology changing. You're going to feel fatigue, malaise, discomfort, and you will be less interactive with people because you're just not feeling well. And that's not uncommon when we are exposed to day-long heat exposures. So one of the other factors that we have to think about is, when would you know if you were overheated? When should you be concerned? That's a critical question. Is it A? Is it B? Is it C, D, or E? Again, the one thing that I always will tell people, and I've seen this so many times, where people will tell me, I feel okay. And I've gone through that, where suddenly you can experience heat-related symptoms that come on like a light switch. So even A is an important uh, symptom to recognize, that slight tiredness builds. So if you have that slight tiredness and you are exposed to successive days of heat, it can lead to a progressive failure in your body. And then that leads to severe symptoms. And by then it can be too late. So when you start to see even that level of fatigue build up, that's a good warning sign that you are in fact overheating. Now, coming back to what I was talking about, heat waves, and some of you have participated in our successive days of heat exposure in our chamber, where we had that lived experience, an apartment style studio chamber. And what did we see? So we assessed conditions that were measured indoors during the Western Heat Dome, where 619 people died. If you remember, July, June, late June, in early July of 2021. There were 619 heat-related deaths. The vast majority were preventable, but these individuals did not have access to indoor cooling. So what ended up happening? Well, in our simulations, in fact, doing those simulated conditions with your help in our lab, we noticed that extreme temperatures result in high progressive increase in the level of heat strain. And you can't get rid of that. So what you see as well is that load on the heart builds and builds, and that creates a stress. Now, some of you may be able to defend against that, and some people will say, well, that's not a high core temperature, and I'm going to show you a figure in a second. And you would say, that's not dangerous. But the key message is the sustained increase that you see in core temperature. I apologize for the coughing. So here it is. Now, this is a case study. And I will tell you that I was a subject for this case study year long. So we had 6 heat waves, August of 2024, all the way to September 2025. Why did we do this? Well, the idea here is to go back to that prior slide. What happened during the Western heat dome? Indoor temperatures reached 40 degrees. I want to give you a sense, even in summer times in some of the long-term care facilities or people that do not have air conditioning in some of the residents, especially high rises, your indoor temperatures can reach 33, 34 in the absence of having air conditioning. But in the extreme heat event, what we saw was indoor temperatures at 40 degrees, nighttime only cooling to 36. So we repeated that. And if you look at core temperature, in fact, these core temperatures during the daytime look relatively benign. In fact, you would say that's probably what you get during an exercise. But what's the problem? You're sustaining that all day long. And across seasons, what we end up seeing is when we transition to June of 2025. So we went through the winter, but here's an example of failure. So that means, as I was saying to you, you can be exposed to heat and be the most resilient person, but it can take that one day where you're experiencing that fatigue, where you're unwell, maybe you're under mental stress, maybe you're physically fatigued because you've been the days before was a nice cool day, you're out exercising, and that creates, our body certainly becomes overwhelmed from just doing that exercise. You can see failure like that. Now, it's just coincidence that that core temperature went down as we started cooling the room, but you can see the higher level of strain. That is dangerous. That's the kind of condition that you can face suddenly. Now, put it in the background. What do you see? You don't see on this figure? Average weight loss, 12 pounds over those 3 days. Is it because, number one, I'm losing weight? No, it's I'm losing body water. And that's a significant strain on the heart because now I have less blood volume to push around. My heart is working so hard now. My heart is under strain. So the reason I want to show you this is because, again, don't misrepresent the fact that you may be resilient. You think that you're, a person who exercises, that you're safe. No, when the body can show normal responses or relatively normal responses, there's still that risk of experiencing a heat-related injury. So you have to be prepared and aware of that. So to that end, it's important to recognize the signs. When we think about the signs, again, I think we always think of some of these more dramatic or these more difficult, challenging conditions like heat stroke. But I want to tell you, number one, heat stroke or heat exhaustion or any of these heat-related injuries, again, it's not always core temperature based. Remember that if you are exposed to heat for long periods of time, you can still develop symptoms that may not be related to high core temperatures, but just the fact that you are sustained strain on the body. So think about if you were out, maybe some of you are doing these half marathons or these walkathons. That is a strain that's no different than if you're sitting in the heat. So you need to recognize that if you are feeling any of these heat-related symptoms, remember they can progress and evolve very, very quickly. And if you are alone, isolated with nobody around you, you will find yourself in a very dangerous situation. So it's important that you take action immediately because, again, you don't see that the organs are under stress. Your gut, your heart, your kidneys are under stress. So it's important that you take action right away. Now, one other factor that we need to think about is that everyday activities do matter because when you're performing activities on top of that, it could just be that you're going for a walk. Maybe you're just doing, a few hours of golf, low key. And we think about that as being low key, but you got to remember it adds heat to the body. It adds to that stress on the body that can put you at greater risk. If in fact the next day there might be another there may be a heat event that occurs. So that can create an elevated level of strain. Remember, most important is that when you combine the two, when you have high heat or even solar radiation, it can still be cool. Your body will gain heat from the sun as well. So very important. But remember, we're not a very efficient system. So when we generate heat, when we do any work, we generate a lot of heat, and that will increase body temperature. And again, remember that we lack that ability to dissipate heat. So some of you may have older kids, maybe some of you have grandkids. And the one thing that is timely and very important for us is that you can take action. There were, excuse me, last year, there were several heat-related deaths in Quebec in children that were attending summer camps. And that is important because children are not just small adults, they lack the ability to thermoregulate. In fact, if we look across the spectrum from a young age, from a child to an elderly person, you see that they have very similar capacities. That is lower capacity. That's very important. So it's not just the fact that they may be in an indoor overheated environment in the school, but you think about outdoor summer events, sports camps, and other camps that may occur. So it's very important for us to take action. One of the most important things that we see with respect to heat exposure is that we know that heat stress can affect a child. It affects their learning. As you can see over here, we see that they become moody, irritable as well. They feel down, they're more withdrawn, they're more disengaged. And the one thing that parents need to recognize is if a child's at summer camp and they've been exposed to heat, you might think that they're despondent because maybe something happened. The heat is a critical factor. Being less engaged means that they may be feeling unwell, and that's a warning sign. That means that their body has been under stress. And that, in the absence of having good sleep, if their sleep is disrupted, let's say, for example, in their home, they have no access to cooling. There's no air conditioning, and indoor temperatures are very warm. They're above 26 degrees Celsius. That can ultimately affect them. So very important here that we recognize the impact of that exposure on children as well. Now, what should you do to help prevent? Again, recognize the symptoms. They're no different than the symptoms that you would experience. Most importantly, like I said, the good example, and we see this with workers, is the behavioral change. How a person is responding to their friends. They're less engaged, less responsive to you. They're not essentially engaged in activities around the home. They're withdrawn. That's a good warning sign that they're suffering from the heat exposure. So take action and put them in a cool spot. Allow them to recover. It's no different than if you've been exercising for a long period of time. Your body needs to recover. Remember, if you do an intense workout, you need a good 24 hours for the body to recover. So why would that be different if you were exposed to heat stress? So helping children stay safe is extremely important, and you can have an active role in that. And again, hydration. Children don't sense their dehydration the same way or fluid loss the same way. No different than as we get older. And again, we were talking about this earlier about the importance of trees. Shade can provide amazing cooling. In fact, when we take a worker and you take them just directly out of the sun and extremely hot, you just put them under a tree and allow for a cool breeze, it has a huge effect. In fact, it's nearly comparable to having them sit in an air-conditioned space. Take plenty of breaks. Timing of activities, right? Morning versus afternoon in the sun, and of course, appropriate clothing attire is important. Now, just to that, I'm just going to raise a bit of awareness, and we're doing some studies just on that, assessing the effects of physical activity as well as different heat mitigations, because we know fans don't work, and we'll be talking about that, and cooling in schools in terms of many of schools in Ontario and across Canada don't have air conditioning, and so they rely upon cooling zones. So we'll be doing, and our study is ongoing. So if you are aware of people and families that are interested in participating in our child in youth study, reach out to us on that. All right, I'm going to ask poll number 4 now. It's important because Catherine McKinney was interviewed on the Ottawa Citizen last week, and we were talking about indoor temperature limits. And I want to come back to that because where do most heat-related deaths occur? Do they occur outdoors or do they occur indoors? Interesting, right? Well, the surprising answer is they actually occur indoors. And again, one thing that we don't realize is that ultimately indoors, if you don't have air conditioning, you're exposed all day long. So that's stress. Certainly, you may go outdoor for a brief period of time, maybe exposed to high heat. Certainly, that will exacerbate things. But most heat-related deaths come from those individuals isolated or confined to their indoor environment for long periods of time. So quite interesting. And I think the one thing that we don't realize is that when we are exposed to those conditions, we don't recognize it. We may feel warm to a certain extent, but we don't recognize that essentially there's that risk. The one thing that is most important is that when an individual is left alone, they may not be able to respond according. Remember what I said to you, you may not sense heat, you may not know that your body's physiology is telling you something, and you're at risk. So one thing to always recognize is if you have a loved one that's isolated, because if you were to phone and do a phone in on them, they might say, hey, I'm okay, don't worry about me. But they may not know that they're under stress. Again, it's not like you can stop exercise, right? If you're in an overheated home, remember that is a stressor on the body, unlike exercise where you can stop generating the heat and essentially recover. You can't just get out of your house. If it's hotter outside, you're going into even hotter environment. Now, for many of you, again, as I showed you earlier, we did a lot of this work to define what should be the ideal temperature condition. Now, based off the work that you helped us do, we define what should be a safe indoor temperature limit, which was 26 degrees. And the reason for that is because at 26, it's still very warm. Don't get me wrong. If you try to sleep at 26, you'd have a hard time. It would not be comfortable. But 26 would be like wearing a seatbelt. It would prevent you from experiencing undue physiological strain, especially if you have successive days of heat exposure. That's why we came up with this guidance over here. This was our first sort of summary that outlines what happens when we're exposed to heat. This is where sustained exposure poses a risk to our health when we are exposed to those conditions. And again, these are long exposures, day long and successive days. And even brief exposures above that can be more harmful. And again, a lot of people tell me, I'm okay. It's my neighbor you have to worry about, and I'm resilient. We all think that, myself included, but I've experienced it, and I know many people have experienced heat-related illnesses. So, how are we building on this knowledge? Is 26 degrees Celsius a safe condition? Now, remember, when we did these studies, we did it for a single day. But the reality is, listen, an extreme heat event is not one day. It's not 2 days. It's going to be multiple days. So one of the questions that we recently posed and with our partners at Health Canada is to say, listen, if I was to keep you at 26, if we're recommending 26, is it safe, especially if I keep it at nighttime as well? Is it going to be okay? Now, the other side of it, we did only nighttime cooling at 26 because, like in Ontario, if you remember back, we had a massive heat dome in 2011. 2011, that's where Toronto experienced a humidex of 51. And in Ottawa, we experienced a humidex of 43, but 51. There was no nighttime reprieve. In fact, during the daytime, we had brownouts, and essentially a lot of people could not access their air conditioning. So in the absence of accessing no air conditioning, we want to see if we only applied cooling at night when there was less air conditioning use, would we be protected? Bottom line is 26 day long, if you were able to cool your home and just keep it at 26, you would be safe. And that's what we saw. That strain, yes, it's slightly higher, but overall, that level of strain wasn't going to be harmful for you. The problem, however, is when we do have that heating during the day long enough to create a stress that as you accumulate day after day after day, it proved to be harmful. So it wasn't enough just to cool the home at night to 26. The problem is that we saw changes in how our body's organs were functioning. We saw changes at the kidney level, changes in the heart, changes in the gut function. So very important that we try to maintain that indoor temperature. So on that basis, what are some of our politicians doing? Well, Health Canada certainly is coming up with its guides of 26 indoor temperature. And Catherine McKinney recently put out a call to have, again, mandate that there's a change in the Residential Tenancy Act that essentially we would have landlords being forced to actually maintain indoor temperature at 26. Now, how's that different from what we see in the wintertime? In fact, in the wintertime, you have landlords that are mandated to keep the apartments warm. So you have now the opposite occurring. But this is very important because there are many vulnerable persons out there that simply do not have access to air conditioning. And this call, although again, I recognize that in Ontario here, municipalities have the ability to change bylaws to mandate that there be 26 degrees Celsius upper limit. And Toronto has done that. British Columbia has done that across its province. It's mandated that there be an indoor temperature limit of 26. But here in Ontario, Catherine McKinney was trying to do the exact same thing. And you should take a look at that Ottawa Citizen article. It's very important. Your work helped contribute to us defining this 26 degree temperature limit. I would note as well that it's a law now in some of the in British Columbia, where now some of the new builds are going to require that there is the ability of the home to be maintained passively at 26, at least part of the home. So this is very important. We are evolving because we are going to experience some of these extreme heat events. Now, let's take it a step further, because many of you participate in our study. What you're doing, you're sitting there at rest, right? So certainly in long-term care, we see, where I've been and spending a lot of my time, you'll see individuals in long-term care sitting, they're not active, but we do see individuals maybe with compulsive disorders that are very, very active. And we also see quite frequently persons that are older overdressing because they don't feel the heat the same way. And I've seen that with my own parents. I've seen that in other people in long-term care that are overdressed, and we don't recognize it because they're saying, "Hey, I'm okay." They're not showing any signs. So one of the things that we were concerned about at the end of the day is saying, okay, if we are going to recommend 26, what should be the appropriate guidance that goes with this? So imagine what happens if I'm overdressed, or maybe there are cultural differences. And some people who are living in certain environments may feel that they need to properly dress and cover their bodies. And then we have as well those that may be overly active. You may be cleaning around the home all day, doing work around the home all day, not perceiving the threat of that increase in heat production. Then you have the combined greater activity and the clothing. So some of you might have participated in our recent study. It was, again, an 8-hour exposure, and we had just used 26 degrees Celsius. These findings are very interesting. Here we go. So after day long sitting in the heat, we saw, again, a slight increase, but it was safe. That goes and supports our guidance. There's a slight increase in core temperature. There was no increase in strain on the heart. So thermal sensation was good. You felt okay. The problem is this: when you got to adding that extra clothing, and that was not thick clothing, that's just, cotton sweatshirt and underwear and sweatpants. And then when you see that, you got this much greater increase in core temperature. When you added just activity with no added clothing, you had even a higher core temperature, and then the combination even higher. Now, I need to put these into perspective so you have an understanding of what this means. So here we are, 26 degrees Celsius in your home. The problem is that when you look at the equivalent increase in core temperature here and here, this is like being at 36 to 40 degrees Celsius, extreme heat, the equivalent of what was observed during the Western heat dome. Imagine, this is higher than any exercise core temperature that you would experience. And this is just very, very light activity, doing activities around your home, and maybe you're overdressed, or even just doing activities around your home and cleaning around the home, doing anything that would elevate that. That is a serious challenge on the body. And if you even maintain that core temperature at 26, that can pose a problem if you're overly active, if you're overdressed. And so there will be updated messaging that comes from that, so we can advise people when you are going to use 26, you have to consider the activity level. Now, what's the best cooling? Because we just talked about 26 is a way we can air condition the place, but in the absence of having air conditioning, what do we do? So I'm going to ask you that question. What's the ideal? What do you use? Maybe some of you use fans. Maybe some of you go to cooling centers. Maybe some of you just rely on drinking cold water or opening up your windows. So what is the optimal? Well, number one, based off all our work, thanks to all of you, and for years and years, the World Health Organization, Center for Disease Control, Health Canada was recommending the use of fans. All right. And we think about the Western heat dome, and you look at that fan, how many fans are being sold at Home Depot, Rona? We get a hot day, people are buying fans and they're selling fans, and that's okay. But we need to be smart about the use of fans. And prior to our work, with your help, we did not know, there was no evidence to support the use of fans. But based off our work and in all the work that we did, we know that fans are not effective in reducing that level of strain. So if I put you in the heat, let's say it's 36 degrees in your home, similar to what was the average temperature indoors in many of the homes here in the Western Heat Dome in British Columbia, and I said, okay, go use that fan. In your mind, what happens is that fan makes you feel cooler. You're more comfortable. The problem is it did not reduce core temperature. It did not reduce the strain on the heart. It did not reduce the impact on all of your organ function. So fans make you feel good, but they did not offset that impact. So feeling good does not equate to lowering that strain. The problem then is you don't take appropriate action. You may then say, I feel okay. I'm going to go outside and I'm going to do some work outdoors for a bit, maybe cut the grass, maybe go walk to go to the grocery store or what have you. So very important. Now, the other one, same thing with ceiling fans. For those that are bedridden individuals, again, what you're going to see in that situation, we think, oh, that cool air while we're lying there is pushing down, is keeping us cool. Well, guess what? There was no significant effect. In fact, that level of strain, even at 31 degrees, we saw these huge increases in core temperature during that heat exposure in bed resting or ridden individuals, provided no cooling. So despite the messaging that's out there and people say fans cool you, they do not cool you. They make you feel better. That then can lead you to a false sense of protection. So, what's important here to recognize? Are fans effective? Well, the short answer, and we published this guidance on the Canadian Medical Association Journal. This is it. At temperatures above 33 or above, fans are not effective. Now, you can, if you don't want to lower your indoor temperature to 26 and waste all that energy in a heat wave, you can combine fans. Fans can be effective, become more effective as indoor temperatures get lower. So they certainly become very effective when you get 31 or below, but they can be effective at 31 if they're pedestal fans. So again, you can combine that, you can raise indoor temperature, so you can combine them to help you. But always recognize that feeling better is not a good indicator that you are safe. All right, so next question I want to ask you, if you went to, let's say, for example, you have no air conditioning in your home and you go to Walmart or the library, how much cooling is beneficial and how long does it last? How long does it help protect you? What's the key answer here? Is it less than 1 hour, several hours, all day? Well, that's an excellent question, right? Because cooling centers are another way that the city advocates to protect the most vulnerable in the absence of having air conditioning in your home. It actually produces only less than an hour of benefit. It's very minimal. In fact, what you see when you enter a cooling center, so if you had here a person that's exposed like we did here, so here's some of you that participate in the study. At midday, some of you received cooling and your core temperature went down. But look what happens upon immediate entry into the heat. You actually store more heat. Why? Because when you go into a cool space, your body shuts down its heat loss mechanisms. And this is why workers think that they're actually losing heat. Just because core temperature doesn't is going down is simply a reflection that you've shut down all that skin vasculature, you're shutting down the sweating, and heat is just being distributed somewhere else in the body. So you're actually shutting down your heat loss mechanism. So when you re-enter your heat, it takes you a few hours to increase heat loss again. So you actually get to the same core temperature as your non-cool counterpart. But here's the danger, folks. Here's the danger. You feel better, but you don't recognize by the end of that period, that 9 hours, or how long you've been in the heat, that you're actually at similar risk as your non-cool counterpart. They recognize it because they don't feel good. You feel good because you just went into cool space. The problem is your physiology is certainly showing you that you're not safe. Very important. So feeling better does not mean your body is protected. And I think what's most important to recognize is the benefit is temporary, extremely temporary. So feeling better again does not make you feel better. So the challenge is this: if you are going to access a cooling center, What's most important to recognize is that, yes, you'll feel better, but recognize that your body's under stress. So what do you need to do as you get back home? You need to go back in that sedentary mode and take appropriate precautions. Feeling good, but protect yourself. Don't become active. Avoid that exposure because you're still at risk. So one thing that we can think about at the end of the day is protecting ourselves and protecting our community and what can we do. So one of the things we say with workers, and I've seen a few heat-related deaths when I've been out in the U.S. and some of the more extreme heat environments with workers, hydroelectric workers, as well as miners. And unfortunately, one of the things that you do see is really workers that are unable to recognize the signs. And so this becomes an important interaction amongst ourselves become important because we cannot rely on ourselves. That's number one. And the one thing I'm sure that you see when somebody's in distress, they behave differently. The way they react to you differs. And so the same thing applies when we are exposed to heat, is that we may not perceive that response. And so when you're interacting with somebody, you can ask them questions. And if they're not reacting the same way, that's an important sign that essentially that person may be under stress. So interacting, reaching out to people, your neighbors, your loved ones, children, if you see that they're exposed to heat, they may not always be at risk, but you need to ask the critical questions. And then through your conversations, you can understand if in fact they are at risk. So one thing to think about is that when you are going to check on somebody, you can access the heat health checklist. That was developed by us with BC Center Disease Control. And what it does is it allows you to make an assessment. So if you are calling your loved one and they're miles and miles away, a lot of people, when we call them, they say, "Oh, I'm okay." But then what you don't see in the background is that their indoor temperatures are high. So you'd want to ask them, there's questions that you would ask. They'll give you critical information about, are they at risk or are they okay? Such thing as you need to ask them, what is their thermostat reading? What do you see sunshine in the home? They'll tell you if they've shut down the blinds and their curtains, what have you. So what's most important is questions. You need to know what questions to ask and the appropriate questions to ask, and certainly assess who's vulnerable. Certainly those without access to air conditioning. There's no question. Air conditioning in an extreme heat event is extremely important. And certainly those individuals with chronic health conditions, because even young adults with chronic health conditions would be at risk. And so it's extremely important that you understand the risk, that you understand what guidance to provide and what actions to take. Even if you were visiting, and I've seen this in certain situations where even during the Western Heat Dome, where elderly adults were brought to the hospital during the 2021 heat wave, and because of the COVID, they were sent back home because some of the healthcare givers thought, oh, they're not showing normal, they're not showing distress. But remember what I said to you, just because they're not showing distress doesn't mean that their physiology is not, putting them at risk. So on that note, I will finish my presentation. Again, apologies for the coughing early on. Certainly open up to questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Glenn. Yeah, we have a few questions. One thing just to confirm that this will be the presentation is going to be um, recorded and that the deck will be, is that available to
Yep.
share?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to go to the questions. There was a question that says, okay, I'm just getting it here. Oops, open. I've read that NHL goalies with all their heavy equipment lose a lot of weight in a game, presumably from fluid loss through perspiration. What strain does this put on their bodies? And I guess, although none of us are NHL goalies, any ramifications for
Yes.
us? Um,
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, again, even in a cooler environment, again, any time, folks, that we lose, remember, I want you to imagine that essentially we have about, if you see this here, you have about, this is about 500 milliliters. You have about, if you look in perspective, 12 of these that really are filled that represent the volume of blood that we have. And when you are dehydrated, as you indicated, the goalie, that dehydration, you're stealing blood from that blood volume. So imagine less and less blood, And now you've got all this open vascular, your body has to push all that blood, heart works hard. That, like anything else, if you know you've been told about the risk when you're shoveling in a cold winter day or heavy snow, the heart is working hard. It's trying to squeeze as much to push that blood out. So what ends up happening as well as we lose fluid, we're stealing that away from all the tissues like our muscles as well. And that will, if you go out and say you're playing pickleball, you're going out golfing, if you were exposed for a few days and you go to, oh, it's going to be cool in the next few days, and you go out and exercise and you're dehydrated, you will feel excessive fatigue. And that is due to the fact that it takes days for your body water to get reestablished. Very important. Severe dehydration, as I showed you, 3 days, 3 nights, I lost on average 12 pounds. That's a lot of weight loss. And it wasn't because I was losing fat, although I wish it could have. It was a lot of water loss. So dangerous. Water loss is danger.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, one of the things that's interesting is it's also you notice that mentioned extra clothing reduces heat loss, which sometimes in the winter, of course, that's good. You want to keep
Yeah.
as much heat, but in the summer, um, it's dangerous. You want to encourage heat loss, I suppose.
And there
Um,
is, yeah, just on that note, just recognize as well, when we expose our skin to heat, to solar radiation, we actually gain more heat. So there is, light clothing that essentially, very thin light clothing is also going to protect from gaining heat in the summertime. It's a bit of a balance sometimes, but indoors, you don't have the sun. That's a whole different thing, right? You want to prevent sunburns, what have you, but overheating of the skin. That's why light, exposed skin is going to gain more heat.
right, which is why it's important to wear like, cotton, like if you're wearing, long sleeve
Breathable
cotton
clothing,
shirts when it's
exactly.
hot.
Yeah,
That actually, even though they're long sleeve rather than short sleeve, they actually provide benefits.
100%.
And you'll correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not a scientist. Next question is, did the core temperature cool for the 2 hours that people were in the AC?
Yeah, so what you see, that drop in core temperature, we need to be extremely careful about that. It's like workers, and this is something you'll see in workers, especially in Texas, when I was down there and some of the western states working with electric utility workers in the field. The only way they can cool is in an open area is they'll sit in their air-conditioned cab. But remember this, that when your skin rapidly cools, you actually are shutting down your heat loss. So that drop in core temperature is just an after drop. It's not truly, you're not removing all that heat from your body. So it gives you a false sense that, in fact, core temperature is going down. It's just that the heat is just redistributing across the body in different regions. So it does give you a false sense of security as well. So that's why we say to workers, it's not effective to sit in air conditioned cabs. What's most effective is to go in a cooler area, shaded area where there's breeze, there's flow of air, because that flow of air will remove to help evaporate that sweat. Now, that's one more thing. If you're outdoors playing golf or even if you have a grandchild, the one thing I've seen parents do, which is a no-no, is essentially taking that wet clothing, that wet t-shirt, and removing it. That is valuable gold. That sweat that's on the t-shirt sticking to the skin as the air comes on top of that will evaporate that sweat, which transfers as long as it's tight to the skin, will cool the body. So don't put a dry t-shirt on top of them. You've now created a greater burden on them.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean it's interesting. I wonder with about the cab, yeah, because we often see cars, and they're obviously they are when the vehicles are sitting there, they are idling, which produces more greenhouse gases, which makes it even worse for climate change. Do you ever share that with the city, like this, or other organizations to encourage their workers to
Yes, we
um,
have, and that's coming. That's the guys that's been out there right now. That's been shared with organizations like Unifor and Hydro One and other companies. Yes, that's good. The other thing
and
too
City
that
of Ottawa? Yeah.
yeah, and
Okay,
the
that's
other
good to
thing,
know.
just so people, just back to the air conditioning, Chris, the one thing as well, I want people to understand when you're sitting in your air conditioned car and you're going to the groceries and it's extremely hot outdoors, recognize that number one, it will take a long time for your body to actually start losing heat. So remember, you may be driving for a while to get to the golf course. you're not protected because essentially you now are going to see in that situation your actually core temperature might rise faster just from you starting to walk in extreme heat because you've been air conditioning. The best thing you can do is limit the air conditioning during your travel to get your body acclimated to start activating its heat loss responses.
Okay. And so air conditioned versus the old 455 open door windows, it's about the same effect, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Question, why is my body, it produces so much sweat more than other people in humid days? This person's wondering.
Yeah.
I think she she said, and this person, as I drink and I sweat right away too. So I think the idea is, are there certain people? I mean, they if I get this wrong, the questioner can add. It's Are there certain people that are more susceptible to sweating more?
Yeah, it's quite possible as well. Just realize that's one of the adaptations to heat exposure. If you're a little more active and maybe you don't use air conditioning, you will see that one of the adaptive responses is to sweat more. The problem in high humidity conditions is you're going to perceive that you're sweating more. That is almost a bit of a mirage, if you will, because remember, high humidity means that less of that sweat evaporates, so more of that sweat is just beating off your or beating on your body. It just can't evaporate. So you might see that your t-shirt, your sweater, whatever is getting soaked. So in a more humid environment, of course, we all will tend to think of ourselves as sweating more. You're not. It's just that that sweat is just not evaporating. So again, sweating more, like I said, is not necessarily a good thing. Because again, it can lead to dehydration. But that's a good question. You will adapt, and one of the adaptations is we sweat more. So it's a two-edged sword, right? We want to adapt, we sweat more, but that leads to a different outcome, greater dehydration.
Okay. We have quite a few questions that have just
Yeah,
come in the last 5 minutes. I'm
yeah,
wondering
go
if you have
for
a
it.
little bit more time.
Absolutely. Yes, for
Okay,
sure.
great. Um, Okay, some exercise settings, such as gyms, offer a sauna. According to what you say, exercising even moderately would suggest that going to warm sauna afterwards would be a bad idea. I guess that's the question.
Yes, it would be. It can be very dangerous. Saunas, again, have their therapeutic benefits, their health benefits. There's no question. But when combined with exercise, especially now, even at some of the gyms that may have air conditioning in a humid environment, you can get heat stress in a relatively cool environment, let's say 24 degrees, 25 degrees. But if it's humid, again, you can't lose that heat. Your core temperature is going to go up. The risk is a strain on the heart, right? When you're exposed to a sauna, the extreme heat will cause, again, the body to respond in a way that's stressful to the heart. So always recognize that. And that doesn't take away from the benefits of sauna or warm water immersion. That's a whole separate component. Isolated itself, it has many therapeutic benefits. So just recognize that when you combine that after, intense exercise or exercising or training in a warm environment, it can lead to perhaps you feeling lightheaded. Maybe you're driving home and you'll suddenly experience lightheadedness. That's not what you want to experience after coming from the gym, especially if you've used the sauna. That's an excellent question.
Okay. Another question about the reference to the 619 people who died during the heat dome. Were most of the deaths in older people or children?
Yes, there were only a few younger persons. They weren't children. The vast majority of the heat-related deaths were in older adults.
Okay. When we say over adults, old, you mean like 65 plus or 60 plus or
50 and above, yes.
50 and above?
And
Okay.
those that were younger, middle-aged, had chronic health conditions, mental health disorders as well.
Right. Okay. Um, will misting yourself by spraying a fine mist of water on yourself help reduce your core temperature when sitting in front of a fan?
Excellent question. The evidence shows us that again, this is all temperature based, right? So when you think about the use of fans, even if you missed, it's not going to benefit you if temperatures are going to be above that 33 degrees Celsius threshold indoors. Certainly below that, it will have benefits. But misting again is, you really have to mist the whole body to have some benefits. If you're just misting your face, there's not going to be any benefit. If anything, it's just going to make you feel better, give you a false sense of security and that you are seemingly protected, right? Because you feel better.
Okay. If you're thanks, I was going to ask that question too, so that is a good question. If you're sweating on a hot day, either at rest or during light exercise, how important is it to maintain electrolytes? How do you know if you need some Gatorade or similar fluid enhancer?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say this much. For the average person, if your diet is okay, and that's no different from workers. Workers work 10, 12-hour days in extreme heat, like you see in Sudbury, for example, deep mechanized mines get up to 50 degrees Celsius. So long as you are properly, your diet is normal, you're not restricting your caloric intake, there's no question that water is the ideal when it comes to maintaining fluid balance. But always recognize that when we change the electrolyte balance in our bodies, we can change the shift in fluid across our body's compartments, which can have a damaging effect. So ultimately, for safety reasons, you should always be hydrating with water. Thereafter, again, over time, you can certainly consume, drinks like Gatorades, especially if you're more active to balance your electrolytes. But again, the first go-to drink is always water, and that's the same thing that's advocated for workers.
Right. So, in other words, if you are, let's say, if you're just around the house, that's okay. But if, let's say, you've done a workout, then it's okay, like running, it's okay to use the Gatorade.
Yes, but always the first thing we always say is water. Water is
Right.
most important because again, anytime you take any kind of electrolytes, you can create a fluid shift. So water is the best thing to preserve blood volume.
Okay. Well, we won't tell the Gatorade people that. Uh, I have anemia and hypothyroidism that
Okay.
causes me to feel colder than most others. Do I still need to keep my air conditioner set for 26 degrees and not wear warmer clothes?
Yes, that's a good question. In fact, yes. I mean, ultimately, the risk is this, as you've indicated, your thermal sensation or your sense of that heat is going to be somewhat compromised, and certainly, maybe your metabolic rate is a little lower, so you may not be generating as much heat. Certainly, you may not need to keep that indoor temperature at 26. But ultimately, like I say, the in an extreme heat event, I would never take that risk of if you know that there's going to be multiple days at high heat. I would be trying my utmost to keep that indoor temperature at 26, regardless of your condition, because you got to remember that your health condition can affect other um, physiological responses. And so I think what's most important is your perception of that heat exposure is going to be somewhat compromised.
Okay. Uh, I'm 67 and cycle daily, even on hot days. I have found that cycling during the last 2 hours of daylight feel acceptable because there is less sun intensity. Am I still in danger?
Yeah, and again, I think ultimately there's any time that we are doing any kind of activity, regardless, it's again the sun just adds to that solar loading. If air temperature is high and it's humid, you're still at risk, right? So you can still be if you went out, for example, did a run late at night and it's a hot, you know how hot and muggy Ottawa can be, certainly down our Toronto to Montreal corridor, it can be hot and muggy. You're still at risk, and it's not uncommon to see heat-related deaths when we do have these very hot, humid conditions. And some of you probably know Texas as a hot, humid environment. And so that's why even at nighttime, and when the sun is setting a bit more, you're still at risk a certain extent. But again, the solar loading is really the complicating factor here. So you're at least eliminating that if you're not exercising in the middle of the daytime where the sun is beaming on it because it adds a lot of extra heat to the body.
Okay. Thank you. Question here. What about eating watermelon and cukes? And I'm just going to add to
Yep.
that. Are there other foods that have been shown to help in terms of reducing the body
Yep.
temp?
Food loss. Yeah, absolutely. Those elements are critical in terms of maintaining hydration, right? And I think ultimately it's just like drinking water. Watermelons, cucumbers all have a good high water content. So that's again a good call on that. Certainly recommend that.
Okay, so any other foods you'd recommend that are, I know you're not a
I'm
diet.
not I'm not a great expert on nutrition. If anything, my partner would tell me I'm terrible in terms of my diet. So I'm not about to give anybody recommendations on appropriate food intake. All I can tell you is just based off recommendations. Water is ideal on that.
Okay. I think that's it for our questions, but I do think that, thank you
I,
for
I have one more thing,
joining.
Chris, if I could, for all your members. I do want to thank all of you for your great contribution. I just want to let you know that you were talking about hydration and myself. We're going to be starting new studies right now. And if you are interested, even for those that are those weekend warriors, love to do work, we're assessing the impacts of multiple days of heat stress. So we're going to look at how heat stress can impact how people that are working, and it could be in stores or manufacturing plants that are overheated. Uh, and we're looking at nighttime, how we can help improve health in those workers. So if you're between the ages of 50 and 70 are interested in, you love activity and you want to engage in this study, reach out to us. And we do have other studies that we're recruiting for as well, including studies with persons with mental health disorders, schizophrenia, depression. So if you have anybody that you know, including our child study. But I do want to thank Chris, all your members, and yourself for the valuable contributions that you've made to our team and to all of our public health partners and our industry partners. I'm indebted to all of you. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure. I'm glad to be able to help out in it. So yeah, the deck will be coming, but the link right now, if you're interested, you can email or visit the website if you're interested in getting on the mailing list for more studies, to be aware of it. Um, so thank you again. Lots of interest based on the number of questions. And I'd like to thank you again, Dr. Glen Kenny, for today's informative session. And given the way very timely as summer is rapidly upon us, and we had a preview of it a few days ago. So remember to look for our follow-up email, and it will include the recording for today's webinar. And finally, remember that you can invite non-members to attend our webinars and try us as a guest. To register for upcoming webinars, please visit the Ottawa branch website at NAFR Ottawa, NAFWR Ottawa.com. Thank you, everyone, and stay cool and not just your body. And remember that even if your body feels cool, that doesn't mean that the physiology is telling the truth. So,
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
okay,
Bye
thanks,
bye.
and bye bye.